With Peter Curran, expert in negotiation. During our last interview, you explained to me what the possible outcome of the Brexit negotiation could be, but the situation at the moment is very, very difficult and very different. Can you please tell us what's from your view, what's the situation now in terms of negotiation?
Well, entering a negotiation, both the parties to the negotiation enter with their most optimistic expectations of the negotiation. They set out their stall, and to a negotiator that's known as their opening positions. They recognise that compromise is inevitable. Negotiators don't think in terms of compromise, they think of negotiating movement within the principles of the negotiation. Now, at that point, there was no precedent for such a negotiation. No one had ever withdrawn from the EU. No country had ever withdrawn from the EU. So neither the EU negotiators nor the British negotiators had any precedent for it. I, as not a diplomat and not a political negotiator, but as a commercial and industrial relations negotiator, was bringing that perspective to bear upon it. And there were immediate problems apparent, that Britain seemed to be going in a very gung-ho mode of we are going to get this, we are going to get that, and they were not setting the climate that is very necessary between negotiators of good intent for a good deal, and that worried me. But the position of Britain, as I saw it, could have been summarised simply by saying, we are withdrawing. It's the democratic wish of the British people to withdraw from the EU, and we intend to do that fully and totally, and then hope to subsequently negotiate an amicable relationship between us. But as their negotiating position unfolded, it became apparent that what they wanted was to leave the EU unconditionally, totally, and take back control, to use the phrase that had been used by the Leave campaign, and then somehow magically restore all the benefits of EU membership without any of the obligations. Now, whether they knew that posture was designed to fail or not is impossible to determine. And I've no doubt the British government was able to seek advice of very expert negotiators, both from the commercial field, the academic field, and the diplomatic field, because diplomacy is simply negotiation applied between countries. That's one definition of diplomacy. Either they didn't listen to the best advice given to them, or they were given bad advice, and I think the former is probably true. I think they probably took good advice and ignored that. And they clearly, to my perception, had serious flaws in their choice of the people to lead the negotiation. At no point in the pre-negotiation phase, which is critical to negotiation, did they display any real understanding of negotiation, of elementary diplomacy, or recognition of the fact that the EU, while shocked and taken aback by Britain's decision to leave, was not approaching this in an adversarial, vengeful retribution mode. Quite the reverse. The EU were hoping to negotiate an amicable exit point, but were committed to protecting the four freedoms of the EU. The British, on the other hand, seem to engage in a constant slanging match. They seem to question the motives and really the commitment of the EU to reaching a deal, which to me, being as objective as I could, was a false understanding of the negotiations. So it progressively began to unwind from there. And then the great gnawing fear appeared among the mass of the leavers who'd wanted to leave, and their representatives in the Tory party, the hardcore leavers, that somehow the purity of Brexit, we are leaving, we're taking back control, was going to be betrayed. And among the big issues, and there were many, was clearly the one of freedom of movement. There was one of the loss of the British contribution, how much did they owe to the EU in respect of having made commitments which they were liable for even though they were exiting. In other words, what is the bill going to be to Britain for exiting? I really believe that the bulk of the leavers believed that they would exit cleanly at the end of the period and they would have total control back. They would have the Great Repeal Act of all EU legislation, but somehow would retain an amicable trading relationship with the EU, somehow go over the massive hurdles of the loss of freedom of movement, loss of the customs union, without there being any penalty for that. And that progressively became unrealistic. But then, almost out of the blue, an issue came up which has proved to be one of the big dividing issues, which I don't think anybody had thought very clearly about, the thorny and intractable issue of the Irish border, the border within the island of Ireland. I mean, Britain's relationships with the island of Ireland have been problematical since the time of Cromwell. We had what was very close to a civil war in Northern Ireland from the late 60s onwards, damaging actions by both sides. And then we had the Good Friday Agreement, which brought relative peace and a measure of economic stability back and loss of the damaging civic unrest to Ireland, and all of that was at risk. And at the heart of this was the British expectation, which could only be described as a magical expectation, that somehow we would be the only country in the world which had a border between us, which had none of the things that go with borders, customs posts, dividing lines, etc. Now, somebody has observed that the British side keep asserting that the border will be as it is at the moment and there will be no changes. The reality is there is no such border between any nations of the world.
Peter, do you think the lack of transparency from the British government is part of the negotiation?
No, I mean, the short answer is no. As a negotiator, I considered the possibility that they had adopted what is a strategy of negotiation. It's not certainly my favoured one, especially in international relations, but come on like gangbusters with maximum noise and fury, but in reality know that they're not going to do that. I mean, I was used to trade union negotiators who'd come and say, we want a 20% increase, and if we don't have it immediately, we'll have an all-out strike which will destroy the company. And within a week, they were negotiating a 5% increase amicably and exited smiling to the nearest pub. Actually, I think that was not the case with Britain. I think it was gross incompetence of the negotiators in the negotiating strategy and a complete failure to understand the dynamics of international negotiation, and crucially a failure to understand the people on the other side of the table. They kept attributing negative motivations to them long past the point. They never exited delaying out the stall period. I mean, negotiation falls naturally into phases: setting out your stall, exploring each other's positions, gradual tentative exploration of possible movements, tangible movements on issues, a bit of toing and froing, backward and forward tidal flow, ultimately reaching provisional agreement laid on the shelf for individual issues on the basis of nothing is agreed till everything is agreed, which in negotiating parlance is known as total package bargaining. You can bargain the elements of the package, hold them provisionally, but they're only on a holding shelf between the parties until the total agreement is clinched. So there was, to my view, grossly inadequate preparation, grossly unrealistic expectations, and frankly, an amateurish ladybird book of negotiation approach throughout.
The main debate now in Scotland is the power grab. and the continuity bill. And you welcome the presentation of the continuity bill on Twitter. I saw some comments from you. What do you think? What do you think about the continuity bill, and what do you think the Scottish government should do preparing the field of Brexit?
Well, the Scottish Government and Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, are in a situation which has not been paralleled for decades, perhaps for a century, in negotiation between countries. As a party committed to independence, in their third term of government, democratically elected by the Scottish people, the Scottish Government is committed to independence. But having failed to gain it in the 2014 referendum, Nicola Sturgeon was also committed to working constructively with the Westminster Government within the framework of the existing devolved settlement. And Nicola Sturgeon, despite being committed to independence, also takes very seriously her role as First Minister of all Scots, as any political leader should do. They may be elected by their party and by their sectional interests, but once elected, they are, whether they like it or not, representative of the total people. And Nicola, as a Democrat, takes that responsibility very seriously. So she is focusing at the moment, almost placing independence on the shelf, and the constitutional issue, the big constitutional issue on the shelf, on the simple fact of protecting the existing devolved settlement. Now, the existing devolved settlement involved us having, as part of the UK state, having powers which normally would reside with a devolved parliament if we weren't in the EU, some of them possessed by the EU. One of the key issues is the common fisheries policy, which is a very divisive issue within Scotland and generally. But what was happening is, under what has been called the EU Withdrawal Bill, or was being called romantically the Great Repeal Bill, where all European legislation was going to be repealed, taken back en masse, unchanged, put onto the British legal statute book in totality, and then gradually nibbled away at under the take back control basis until we found the balance of that legislation that suited us. We fully expected that the consequences of the Great Repeal Bill was that Scotland would gain back all of the powers, not some of them, all of the powers that had been taken back from the EU under the devolved settlement, which divides clearly between reserved powers, which are reserved to the UK government, and powers which are reserved to the devolved governments. Instead, we found a steady and very insidious attempt to erode our control over these powers. And the powers that the UK seemed very anxious to retain control over were the very powers that were fundamental to Scotland's economic and social success. And we were determined not to let that happen. Now, the only base of challenge under the devolved settlement, because the devolved settlement is under the Scotland Act, which really means that Scotland is in a dog leash of being allowed to wander freely within defined areas, but they can be yanked back into the kennel at any point by the Westminster government. And that's exactly the situation we're in. So we distrusted that and put the label on it of a power grab. We felt that we're trying to erode the autonomy of the Scottish government in certain areas. Now, I'm not oblivious to the great contradictions that arise here, because you can argue against that. The Scottish government wants to have these powers back, only to give them back to the EU because they're committed to the EU and EU membership if independent. So that's where they're at. The continuity bill is on a difficult legal foundation, and it was drafted in haste of necessity, but it was right to draft it. And it relies on the fact that Britain has no constitutional, formal written constitution, but conventions. And one of the conventions is, if I remember it rightly, I think it's called the Sewell Convention, which any change to the devolved settlement has to be by consent. Now, the UK government is hanging its hat on consultative,
Yeah.
but everybody knows the difference between consultation and negotiation. Consultation means, well, I will take your views into account, but I then unilaterally am free to decide whether I take account of them or not. So we are challenging on a legal basis that has already been contested by our own presiding officer in the Scottish Parliament, based purely on the legal interpretation. So it's a bizarre thing, and to use an ancient Roman term, we're moving closer to, in legal terms, to something called the jus natural, which is, the reality is that constitutional settlements are not made on a legal basis. The legal basis is a kind of pedantic backdrop to political hardball negotiation. And how this one will come out is anybody's guess. I have to say that Nicola has shown absolute willingness to meet, to talk, some even among her own supporters say long beyond the point she should have, and has been rebuffed brutally at every point by the UK government. And we're certainly heading to the possibility of another independence referendum with all that that implies.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for all your information, for your view. I keep an eye on the Scottish politics, as you know.
Sure we do.
And really enjoy listening to all debates, and it's been a pleasure listening to you.
May I say something briefly about
indeed.
Catalonia?
Oh, yes.
Cautiously, because I don't want to pretend understanding of something that is very complex and I know affects a very much wider population and interest in Scotland. But Catalonia is perceived by Scottish independence supporters as a dry run for all the key issues that they would meet if they had to pursue independence. Crucially on the point that we may come to the point where we call another Scottish referendum legally by decision of our devolved Parliament and are told by the UK Prime Minister that we may not have it. And we are then, in the absence of an Edinburgh Agreement too, a repeat of the kind of agreement that David Cameron made, that we could hold a referendum and the result would be observed by both parties and respected. We could face every step that Catalonia faces. So it's almost like looking through a time machine into our future, and Scots widely across the spectrum, independence and not independence, either are or sure as hell ought to be fascinated by what's happening in Catalonia.
What do you think the outcome is going to be in terms of referendum?
I would have to be Nostradamus to say that. My personal hope is that we have it very soon, because I think time is running out to make a decision. And I feel there are very uncomfortable forces marshalling across the continent and in Britain, which are not my idea of what a democracy should be. I have a feeling we might lose fundamentals of our democracy if we don't move very fast indeed.
So will you encourage the Scottish government to go for it?
I've been arguing since the Brexit referendum in 2016 that we should go for a second independence referendum at the earliest time. I feel we've been bleeding away time and energy. And there is a school of thought which I respect but don't share, that we have to wait for a perfect time. I don't believe there will be a perfect time. I think this sweater is unravelling on us into a ball of wool by the day, and we have to move fast and hard.
Well, thank you very much, Peter.